The press release by the CDC on August 11th of 2022 reduced some of the COVID mitigations. But reducing these COVID-19 mitigations during an outbreak is dangerous for elderly citizens because they have increased comorbidities and are in close contact with other patients. The CDC states that for medically significant illness increases with age, disability status, and underlying medical conditions increases your risk of catching COVID. Now, a group of scientists, Davis, Chung, and Juarez, conducted a study using a population of over 850,000 participants and found that comorbidities increase with aging and multiple comorbidities increase with aging. This is a graph of they looked at high blood pressure, high cholesterol, high blood pressure and high cholesterol, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and heart disease, and no, this one's heart disease, I'm sorry, and this one's diabetes, and this is all four of them together. And so they looked at the prevalence of how much, the y-axis is the prevalence and the x-axis is the age, and they were looking at the prevalence, like the percentage within their population that had these comorbidities, and that they found that with aging, you see an increase in comorbidities, and you also see an increase in the number of comorbidities happen. Now, this is important because, again, the CDC was talking about how this immune compromisation that these comorbidities have increases the risk that these patients have more severe side effects from COVID, and also they are at higher risk of death. Unfortunately, another CDC study is looking at and using an 18 to 29-year-old group to look at how the rates of COVID and catching it. Now, they only have a one-time increased risk, but they have, if you're hospitalized, the aging population, it starts at 50 to 64-year-olds at 3 times more likely than 5, 8, and 15 times more likely with like 10-year gaps to catch COVID, and then also need hospitalization. Now, the really scary number is that it increased so much more significantly with this third category here, which is death. So you have 18 to 20-year-olds 1 times, 10 times, 25 times, 60 times, 140 times as likely, and 340 times as likely to die from COVID. This is kind of a big deal because, again, we're talking about immune compromised patients. Now, I also want to address the fact that some of these comorbidities that aren't being talked about are also, you have to think about patients with dementia, Alzheimer's, who aren't oriented to space and time correctly, or even to like who they are and where they're at. So some of these patients might not understand that they're in elderly folks' homes, and unfortunately, the CDC also found that communicable spaces, community activities, and close quarters living quarters in multifamily housing increase the risk of getting and spreading the virus. So, considerations are important in multifamily housing for older adults, especially, or residents and living in settings that incorporate congregate or supportive services. And so you're talking about patients who are more likely to catch COVID just from being in close contact with other patients because of the sheer number of patients that are in the building, the number of nurses that are visiting the building, and how many people are visiting these patients. It is important for us to consider these outcomes from reducing the COVID-19 mitigations, and that again, reducing these during an outbreak is dangerous for these elderly citizens because of their decreased immunity and their likelihood of having comorbidities and living in close contact with other patients. Thanks.